Hey, everybody. It's time for yet another one of Maynard's chapter presentations, this time on Chapter 8, Groups and Organizations. So without further ado, let the magic begin. John Donne, Donne. Who was he? Hmm. A person? Yes. Sounds like a dead person because you said, who was he? Well, he was a poet and a metaphysicist. And this quote really defines what this chapter is all about. He said, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am so involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the death bell tolls. It tolls for thee." So the point here, and it's very similar. Let me give you a Star Wars example. You may recall in the very first Star Wars movie, there is Obi-Wan Kenobi on the Millennium Falcon, and he's standing there, and all of a sudden he goes, whoa. Why? Because Alderaan blew up, and he suddenly felt the loss of millions and millions of lives of people. Why? Because he's so connected with mankind. So this is very similar to what the mystics argue, that everything in the universe is interconnected and interpenetrated. The question is, how much are we aware of that? Social groups are two or more people who identify with one another and have a distinctive pattern of interaction. The social reality application here is who you hang out with will help determine how you will be shaped, how decisions by and about you will be made, how your work environment is organized. So as social beings, we will virtually all experience group life. So it's kind of like your parents said to you, be careful who you hang out with because they're going to affect you. Boy, I always remember the look on my parents' faces as I drove away with the motorcycle gang every weekend. Groucho Marx said, by the way, he was a comedian. I feel it's not necessary to preface that. I would never want to belong to a club that would have me as a member. Charles Horton Cooley developed the concept of primary group as a small social group in which relationships are both personal and enduring. So this is like your family and close friends. Primary, by the way, is from the Latin prime, meaning first. From Cooley's work, the concept of secondary group, which means from the Latin following, secondary group, was inferred by other sociologists to describe a large and impersonal social group based on a specific interest or activity. So, for example, it could be your coworkers or members of this class or members of an organization to which you belong. So, in other words, the primary group are the people who are most influential in your life, but there's a secondary group, and those people are also influential in your life, probably not as much as the primary group is. I got another quote. This is from psychologist Lev Vygotsky. He said, through others, we become ourselves. I think this was a rather prophetic comment. This was made by Cooley in 1909, and boy, did he start projecting ahead what was going to happen living in mass society. He said, in our own life, the intimacy of the neighborhood has been broken up by the growth of an intricate mesh of wider contacts, which leaves us strangers to people who live in the same house. Well, my family was pretty strange to begin with, so that's not surprising. All righty. Let's get to some of the stuff. Now, just to give you how important reference groups are, we could, if we want, have a little discussion right now between me and myself as to what would be your reference group in different situations. such as what's your reference group in choosing your clothing? Or what's your reference group in evaluating your physical attractiveness? Like, how do you know if you're hot or not? You know, based on what? I always chuckle because when we have this discussion in class, students almost always will rattle off, well, media and different forms of media like magazines and advertisements and what other people are wearing and blah, 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 blah. And hardly anybody says their sig other. Yeah, who asks him or her for reference point? You know, personally, I have a magic mirror at home. And in terms of evaluating my physical attractiveness, every day before I leave, I go, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the biggest stud muffin of all? And it goes, you big guy, right back at you. Well, enough of this faldy-roll. Let's move on to page 198. You need to know about group leadership. You need to know about leadership roles and leadership styles. Leadership roles, there are two. One is instrumental leadership, refers to group leadership that emphasizes the completion of tasks. They are performance oriented. These leaders want to get things done. At best, they're more secondary group oriented toward the supervisees. So they don't have that strong bond of affection. It's more of a secondary group relationship. Expressive leadership is more concerned with the collective well-being of the group than in accomplishing goals. The idea here is to raise group morale, minimize tension and conflict. So expressive leaders are more primary group oriented. Now, both want to get tasks done, instrumental and expressive. However, they go about it in different ways in terms of how they perform that role. Leadership styles are based on decision-making styles. Authoritarian leaders are instrumental in their outlook, make decisions on their own, and demand strict compliance from subordinates. They do not seek and probably will not receive affection from the group. But you can make the case they're the most effective in a crisis situation. So imagine we're in a classroom and the fire alarms go off and we're trying to decide, shall we ignore them or do something about them or what? Because they go off so frequently if you live in Curtis. Anyway, yeah, and you know why? It's because despite signs like, do not open this door, it will set off the alarm, people open the door and it sets off the alarm. I know this because I talked to the campus police when they investigate. Or somebody was making popcorn in a room and it set off the smoke alarm. Hey, these things happen. Anyway, so let's suppose the alarms go off and the room's beginning to fill with smoke. And so me, as your authoritarian leader, says, get out of here right now. And boom, we're out. Very effective in a crisis situation. Democratic leaders try to include all in the decision-making process, and thereby they receive the benefit of everyone's ideas, imagination, and reflection to task assignments. However, they're less effective in crisis situations. So let's go back to my scenario where the room is beginning to fill with smoke. So as a Democratic leader, I will say, now listen, I don't want to make the decisions here. This is a democracy. Do I have a motion? Yes, I hear a motion that we leave the room. Do I hear a second of the motion? Okay, well, shall we discuss that? Meanwhile, the room continues to fill with smoke. Now, do I have a motion to close the discussion? Yes. Okay, well, let's take a vote. How many are in favor of getting out of the room right now? How many opposed? And how many abstain? Okay, well, the vote is to get out of the room, which is now half filled with smoke. Laissez-faire leaders, which is from a French term, let them alone. Sometimes you'll hear this applied to how classical capitalism operates, that it's laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire leaders minimize their position and power, allow the group to operate more or less on its own, generally are the least effective in promoting group goals and in crisis situations. So if we were running things if I was your laissez-faire leader and the room started to fill up with smoke, I'll be out of here so fast it'll make your head spin, yelling back to you, Feel the power. You decide what to do. Would you really leave us behind like that, Maynard? Maybe. Okay. Now, think back, think back, think back. Now, remember, I suggested that whenever I start off with, you may remember in a previous presentation, just nod your heads. It makes me feel better. So you may remember in a previous presentation, Maynard. Because, then when I say, what? We had, I asked you to please memorize the 10 key values in American society as delineated by the sociologist Robin Williams. So if you think about those dominant American values, which of these three styles of leaders is most consistent with dominant American values? Authoritarian, democratic, or laissez-faire? American values, authoritarian, democratic, or laissez-faire? Well, you could probably make the case that democratic, sure, because we're a democracy, or laissez-faire, power to the people. But here's my point. Don't you think it's rather interesting that while those styles of leadership are very consistent with democratic values, that in fact, when we go into the workplace, it's almost always authoritarian? So why, for 40 hours or more each week, do we willingly give up democracy? One person, one vote. I should have a say in a vote and what goes on, because after all, it's the workplace. It must be run authoritarian. It's really interesting. It flies in the whole face of the rest of society, and it's hardly ever questioned. More on that in a bit. In the meantime, let's look at page 198. You need to know about group conformity and each of the three key theorists here, Ash, Milgram, and Janus. We'll start off with this section includes the research of Solomon Ash, who in 1952 used visual perception cards, which demonstrated that many of us will compromise our own judgment to avoid discomfort. Check out figure 8-1, where you will see that 99% were accurate in comparing the lines without group pressure, but as soon as group pressure came on, their own judgment was hindered by the pressure, and it dropped to 66% being accurate in comparing the lines. So the lines didn't change, it's this group pressure changed, and so it changed people's minds, to show you how profound group pressure can be upon our own personal thinking. Stanley Milgram in 1963 and 1964 developed his simulated electric shock experiments. These I find really interesting, and if you walk down the halls of the psych department, you will see on the walls pictures of Stanley Milgram's electric shock experiment. So the idea was, let's suppose I am the person doing the experiment, and I'm going to work with another person who's going to be an actress, and she's going to be sitting out before us, and you are standing next to me, and you're going to be the person we're running the experiment on. So the person sitting in the seat, who's part of this plot experiment, this seat is allegedly wired with electricity. And so, and this person's going to act as though it is, even though it's not. And so what I'm going to tell you to do is every time we ask her a question and she gets it wrong, I'm going to tell you, you got to give her an electric shock. And we're going to have a dial here. And the more times she gets it wrong, the more you crank up the shock. And so what would happen in the experiment is, as people would get the questions wrong on purpose, and the people were allegedly hitting them with electric shock, they didn't flinch. They just kept cranking it up. Even though the people, the actress sitting in the chair was visibly pretending to be in pain, it didn't stop them from cranking it up. Well, I'm sorry, she got it wrong. Crank it up. Oh, I don't know what. Crank it up. And they would. And the person would be sitting in the chair going, ah, or something like that. Use your imagination. Stanley Milgram said, The essence of obedience consists in the fact that a person comes to view himself as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes, and he therefore no longer regards himself as responsible for his actions. The person who with inner conviction loathes stealing, killing, and assault may find himself performing these acts with relative ease when commanded to do so by authority. Well, after all, authority figure tells you to do something, that's all you need to know. And so understandably, if somebody's standing there in a lab coat, you got to do what the person tells you to do, because after all, they're wearing a lab coat. So they decided, okay, they're all to the experiment. Instead of some person standing there in a lab coat telling the person what to do, they would get phone instructions. And they found that even with phone instructions, there was only a 20% drop in compliance. So crank it up, give them a greater shot. You know, lab coats have always historically told us this person's legit. Look at all the pharmaceutical ads, you know, where the person stands there with a lab coat and a stethoscope. And even though the fine print at the bottom says, this is not really a doctor, boom, too late. The image is in our head. My God, it's a doctor. This must be legit. The doctor says this drug is good. What more do I need to know? It's not a doctor. Just because a doctor says it's legit doesn't mean it's legit. But more on that later. Okay, Milgram's research was widely criticized for the stress it caused his subjects. So yeah, people cranked it up, but they were also undergoing tremendous stress in doing so because they saw this person being visibly affected with pain by them cranking it up. Didn't stop them, but they still cranked it up. He responded to his critics by pointing out that this stress was not a deliberate or intended outcome. It was just, hey, he too was shocked by their reaction. All right, I'll move on. What else do we got here? We also have Janus's experiments. Irving Janus, who in 1972 and then again in 1989, he developed a concept called groupthink. Groupthink is a limited understanding of some issue due to group conformity, resulting in narrow views on some social issue. So the idea is when you have the same group of people talking all the time, they begin to think alike. And that's why, for example, among other reasons, you rotate people on the boards of trustees, or you want to bring in fresh people, or any kind of an agency where they have a board of directors, you want to continue to bring in fresh people so you continue to get fresh ideas. So he found that what happened is that groups develop a distinctive language which inhibits communication with outsiders. So it's like going to IT, you know, and they rattle off all this stuff. And for somebody who's a technological idiot like myself, I barely understand what they're talking about, but boy, they certainly understand it. And they're helpful. It's just, I don't get the lingo sometimes. 2, groups seek consensus and therefore unduly narrow the range of options. And 3, after agreeing on a position, alternative and possibly useful views are treated as oppositional. Okay, well, a great example is the current Trump administration, which has had one of the highest, I think the highest turnover of presidential cabinets in American history. So as you notice, Trump continues to go through different people manning key positions in his cabinet because they don't necessarily agree with him. And so when you don't agree with them, that's viewed as oppositional, not as, that's an interesting point of view, perhaps I should consider. And he's not the only one. George W. Bush did the same thing when he was in office. And so what happens is you begin to surround yourself with people who think exactly like you, which may be good, may be bad, but I would say that's not the healthiest way to run anything. You know, the way to run something is you want to get people who purposely don't always agree with you so that you get the widest range of possible options so that you can select the best option that may be in the interest of the American people, for example, in the case of the president. So you necessarily need it. So what a good administrator does is He or she does not surround herself with people who just think the same way she does. Instead, you have people with different points of view, which is healthy, and the administrator conducts discussions, listens to what everybody has to say, and then has to make a decision. But that way, at least you heard every point of view, ideally. Nevertheless, even in settings like that, people begin to think alike. Let's see here. The point of group conformity is that all of these are ways in which authority figures, whether it could be significant others, parents, teachers, religious authorities, all these people dramatically influence our opinion and push us toward conformity. A great example, too, is Adolf Eichmann, who was a Nazi death camp officer. He said in his defense as to why he was responsible for killing so many Jews at the Nazi death camp, his defense was, I was only following orders. Well, see, that's not enough. You can't just say, well, I had to do it because an authority figure commanded me to do so. Even in the United States Military Code of Justice, there are times in which you as a soldier have to distinguish between wartime killing and murder, where innocent civilians are being killed unnecessarily. I say unnecessarily because in all wars, civilians get killed, unfortunately. Okay, in terms of groups, approximately 10 million US adults participate in self-help groups each year. About 25 million do at some point in their lives. So they could be related to substance abuse or addictions. It could be related to having some sort of a disease that you have some support. It could be in relation to people who are caregivers and they need some support. Okay, starting on page 204, we're going to talk about formal organizations, characteristics of bureaucracy. Now, you will remember I said in a previous chapter when we were discussing Max Weber that he also talked about bureaucracy, and he thought bureaucracies were just the most rational, efficient way to run things. And I said, I will get back to it when we get to this chapter. Well, here we are. Characteristics of bureaucracy. It's an organizational model rationally designed to perform tasks efficiently. So you need to know the 6 aspects of a bureaucracy. Why? Because most of you, if you're not already, will be working in a bureaucratic setting. So it's best to understand how they tend to operate. First is their specialization, where people have highly specific duties. And so in any organization, you have somebody who's in charge of the finance, somebody who's in charge of the mailroom, somebody who's in charge of sales, the regular workers carrying out the tasks, so on and on and on with the hierarchy, but everybody has highly specialized tasks. 2, there's a hierarchy of offices, and typically it's a pyramid structure. So at the top, you have the big boss. Then as you move down the pyramid a little bit, you have a few more people there. There are vice presidents. Then as you move down and the pyramid gets wider, you have more people at middle management. And then finally at the bottom of the pyramid are where most of the workers are doing the more routine tasks that the people at the top are telling them to do. 3, there are rules and regulations which are designed to create predictability. In any large-scale bureaucracy like a college or a hospital or a corporation, how do you keep everybody on the same page? Because while you want to give people some freedom to do their thing, on the other hand, you got to make sure they're accomplishing the mission of the college, the hospital, or the company. And so there are rules and regulations to help achieve that everyone has to follow, regardless of your job capacity or specialization. 4, you have to have technical competence to perform your duties. And so you see an ad in the paper, they need somebody who is going to, they need a new accountant here. So you apply and they say, well, do you have any training as an accountant? No, 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 but sounds like a great job. No, see, you have to have the technical competence to do that particular job and maybe even credentials. 3, impersonality. Impersonality means, hey, we treat everybody fairly. We treat everybody the same. We don't play favorites. 6, formal written communications guide the operation of the organization. Well, again, the rules and regulations are formalized in written form so that it's there for everyone to see. For example, there is a student handbook here at the college which has all the rules and regulations that govern being a student, and that detail your rights, duties, and responsibilities as a student. It's like when you start a new job, you have to read the employee's handbook. And so, well, I'm not going to read it. Well, you sign off that you did. And so you better read it, because having signed off on it, you are now responsible for carrying out and fulfilling everything that's in that employee handbook. Okay. To give you evidence of bureaucracy's expansion, in 1950, there were 10 million farmers in the United States being served by some 84,000 employees in the Department of Agriculture. So this meant there was a ratio of 118 farmers to 1 bureaucrat in the Department of Agriculture. By the year 1990, there were only 2.9 million farmers, but they're now being served by 129,000 Department of Agriculture employees. So now you had 22 farmers for every bureaucrat. If these trends of growth and decline continue, by the year 2060, there will be more bureaucrats in the Department of Agriculture than there will be farmers in the United States. But I guess that's kind of nice, you know, if you're a farmer, you have a one-to-one relationship with somebody in the Department of Agriculture. Another example of bureaucracy's expansion, David McIntosh observed, the Lord's Prayer is 66 words. The Gettysburg Address is 286 words. And there are 1,322 words in the Declaration of Independence. Yet, government regulations on the sale of cabbage total 6,911 words. Just on the sale of cabbage, 26,911 words. Now, what are some of the problems or limitations of bureaucracy? Well, one, bureaucracies tend to dehumanize those they serve by effectively striving to treat everyone the same. Okay, so imagine you're a customer service person in the bureaucracy, and first of all, the trick is, can you reach that person? Can you get through the phone blocks where it says, okay, you get on the phone, it says, okay, now press this if you want this, press this if you want this. Well, you could spend 20 minutes just pressing the buttons and never reach anybody. I just keep pressing 0, 0, 0, 0 until I reach somebody. Okay, then you reach somebody and you explain your unusual situation as to why, I don't know, you couldn't make your payment. You say, see, there was a hurricane, I lost everything. I'm sorry, sir, we have to treat everyone the same. We can't make exceptions for you. But see, no, you don't understand. This is actually what happened. I'm not making this up. This happened. I'm sorry, sir, we have to treat everyone the same. Robert Merton observed, the impersonal treatment of affairs, which are at times of great personal significance to the client, gives rise to the charge of arrogance and haughtiness on the part of the bureaucrat. A second limitation, Weber noted that bureaucracies alienate their workers. In other words, we talked about this with Marx, that the workers feel alienation in so many different ways. And so Merton said, with increasing bureaucratization, it becomes plain to all who would see that man is, to a very important degree, controlled by his social relations to the instruments of production. This can no longer seem only a tenet of Marxism, but a stubborn fact to be acknowledged by all. 3, bureaucracies affect our lives, but we have little say-so in their operation. And we talked about this before when we talked about Marx's points of alienation, where workers have certainly no vote and they rarely have any say in what's going on in the operation itself. Decisions are made for them, not by them. A recent Los Angeles Times poll asked, should employers be allowed or not allowed to listen in on employee telephone conversations? Yes, said 6%. No, said 93%. Scan the work area with video cameras as they do the classrooms. Yes, 38%. No, 56%. Ooh, here's a scary one. Require employees to take drug tests. Ooh. Yes, 76%. No, 19%. Now I want to get back to this. You know, over the years, when I'm teaching in the classroom, I'm always gesturing to the projector on the, up in the ceiling. And because I know there's a camera in there observing everything I do. And people have accused me of paranoia. And I always point out it's not paranoia if it's true. So I thought, you know, maybe I am being paranoid. So I went over to the campus police office and I was talking to Don. And while I was talking to him, I noticed all the cameras in the background where they, you know, monitor what's going on the campus. And I said, so Don, I'm just kind of curious, are there cameras in the classrooms? And he said, oh yeah, but not all of them. And he said, why do you ask? I said, nothing at all, just curious. Paranoid, am I? To show you how far we've come about privacy. On the first coin, the first federal coin minted in the United States, which was in 1778, appeared the following phrase, mind your own business. Wow, that's what the founding fathers and mothers thought. Can you imagine? They must be rolling over in their graves like they're on a rotisserie, given the lack of privacy people have now, where the government knows so much about us, every credit card company, where they can predict what you want to buy before you even know you want to buy it, and they'll know what color it is. A fourth limitation of bureaucracy, the so-called Peter Principle. The Peter Principle is that what happens in a lot of bureaucracies is when someone retires or leaves, who's the next person up? The next person in seniority. You take that person's position. Well, that just because you've been there longer doesn't mean you have the competence to take on that position. And the Peter Principle is that in many times these people don't have the competence. So people keep getting elevated to positions they're not capable of doing. And as a result, you have Peter's corollary, which is that eventually all positions in a large organization will be filled with incompetence. I can make a political commentary here, but I won't. 5, bureaucratic ritualism, red tape, a preoccupation with rules and regulations as ends in themselves, where people just become slavish followers to the rules. It kind of reminds me of Ned Flanders in The Simpsons, where he just follows the rules, follow the rules, neighbor Reno, because that's what life is about. You must follow the rules. Following Weber's analysis, the most effective way to destroy a bureaucratic organization would be to eliminate not its officers, but its files. Let me give you an example from the sensational 60s. Back in the 60s, they enacted a draft, and everybody, as soon as they turned 18, had to register for the draft. Now, these records were kept by the local county office. And so it occurred to some, I will say, unscrupulous hippies that if they broke into the office and burned all the files, there'd be absolutely no record of whether or not they registered, as in they can't get drafted. And so that actually took place until the federal government wised up and centralized all those records in Washington, where it would be safer. Let's see, here's another great example. In the early 1980s, we reached the highest point of nuclear weaponry between us and the Soviet Union. I think the peak was 30,000 nuclear warheads. enough to destroy several planets. But nevertheless, that's where we were. So people began getting increasingly scared there could be nuclear war. And a movie, I think the movie in England actually took place earlier than this, but they had a movie, about a 40-minute movie, that showed what would happen in the event of a nuclear attack in England. And then similarly, in the early 1980s, there was a two-part TV show that showed what would happen if there'd be a nuclear strike on Lawrence, Kansas. And you think, well, why would they strike Lawrence, Kansas? Because when you go out in the Midwest, throughout those cornfields, there are nuclear missiles. Literally, with the permission of the farmer, there are nuclear missiles under those farm fields. And the reason why is you don't want to put them all in one place, because then the Ruskies could knock out all your missiles. So you had them scattered all over the Midwest. And literally the field would open up, and a missile would come shooting out of it, heading to Russia. So anyway, when people watched this show, it showed what would happen when a nuclear holocaust took place in Lawrence, Kansas, and it freaked out America. So as a result, there was a huge call, and it helped launch the movement in the United States to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Anyway, I'm trying to set the stage for this. During this period of time, the Internal Revenue Service issued a statement that even in the event of a nuclear war, they expected people to pay their taxes on time. Now that's a bureaucracy for you. So let me get this straight. Let's suppose that everything east of the Mississippi was a nuclear holocaust. Everybody west of the Mississippi still supposed to send in their taxes? To whom? How do you know? Is the government even exist anymore? Does the country even exist? What constitutes the survival of a country? And the final limitation of a bureaucracy is bureaucratic inertia, the tendency of bureaucratic organizations to persist over time. Well, when I took a grad school course on organizations, one of the first rules of thumb was organizations are like living things. They struggle to survive. So even when they endure bankruptcy, they come back again under a new name so that they can keep it going, keep it going. Now, having said that, obviously corporations don't last forever. And we've seen in recent years, some corporations that have been around for a century, like Sears and J.C. Penney, are going out of business. Also mentioned in the text are what are called sunset laws. And sunset laws are, you pass a law like the Patriot Act, which was passed after 9/11, that only lasts 3 years, and then it automatically expires, forcing Congress to determine whether or not they want to renew it. At the time in the 60s, that was the same situation with the draft law. It had a sunset provision. Now, you may think that's a great idea. Why don't all laws have a sunset provision so that laws don't go on in perpetuity? Well, here's a great example. Look at Congress in the last couple of years. They can't pass anything, it seems. And then you want them to have to repass every law every 3 years. It would be impossible. Okay, starting on page 208, you need to know about the evolution of formal organizations. So in the text, it describes that in the early 1900s, businesses were very inefficient. As a response, Frederick Taylor introduced the concept of scientific management, the application of scientific principles to the operation of a business or other large organization. The principles of scientific management suggested that workplace power should reside with owners and executives who have historically paid little attention to the ideas of the workers. Okay, so to give you an example of scientific management, in my factory days career, I worked at one factory where I was operating a drill press, and you could earn what was called piece rate. So the idea was they would set what would be a standard normal time to perform an operation, and if you could do better than that, you'd earn extra money. Okay, so I'm performing a new operation, and what would happen is a guy called the time study would come with a clipboard and a stopwatch, and he'd watch me perform the function. Okay, well, If I wanted to make peace rate, the idea would be to go in slow motion while he's watching. But he's hip to that. And so he realizes you're artificially going too slow. And so he'll just keep standing there until you perform at a faster pace. So the trick was to do it fast enough to get rid of the time study and have it as a matter of record as to how long it takes to perform this operation. And then once he left, you could go faster because then you could make peace rate. That was scientific management. Formal organizations based on scientific management principles now face three major challenges described in your text. The first challenge is race and gender. This is based on research by Rosabeth Kanter. Rosabeth Kanter cut her academic teeth, as they say, by studying communes back in the 60s and the 70s because she was curious why some communes lasted and others did not. One of the things she found is those which lasted had a strong economic base. So, for example, in Aussie, I don't know if it's still around, but there was a commune called The Farm in Tennessee that produced tofu. And tofu has been a hot item ever since the 1960s and the 1970s. So with that economic base, that commune lasted. Anyway, Kanter's research on bureaucracies advocates opening up organizations to women and minorities, as the ideas of the 1960s have now become more widely accepted. Also, she said, open the organization to enable change and advancement of workers to happen more often. The second challenge is the Japanese work organization. The key point is that the Japanese model of organization reflects the collective orientation of Japanese society. What I mean by that is the Japanese society is one of the most homogenous in the world, where 90% of the people are in fact Japanese, and that's the way they like it. Only 10% are non-Japanese. And they have a very collective orientation as opposed to our highly individualistic orientation. So interestingly, or not, you'll be the judge, when they opened the first automobile manufacturing plant in America, which was for Nissan in Smyrna, Tennessee, they thought, okay, well, we'll hire ex-auto workers. After all, they already know how to make cars. And they said to them, now listen, from now on, instead of just taking orders, we're going to organize you into quality circles. And you're going to work as teams, and you're going to make the decisions. Well, they found it was really difficult to implement because the workers were so used to taking orders from other people that even when given the opportunity to make decisions on their own, they didn't want to do it, and they didn't want the responsibility for having to make those decisions. Now, in time, it worked, and they got people to think that way, but it was very difficult because we're such an individualistic society, and because we just accept authoritarianism in the workplace as normal. So in effect, formal organizations in Japan are like large primary groups, remember, like family and friends. So some of the features are hiring and advancement. The workers are hired in groups, giving everyone the same salary and responsibilities. 2, there is lifetime job security, which fosters a strong sense of worker loyalty. So competition for jobs when one graduates from high school or college in Japan is intense because once you get the job, you're guaranteed that job for life. Now, we certainly don't do that here because we treat workers like they're chattel. But anyway, and the thinking is, what, if I guarantee a job, it'll be like guaranteeing a professor tenure. It won't do anything anymore. That's just a joke for the rest of the faculty. Anyway, but in Japan, it has the opposite effect. It's like, what? You're going to guarantee me a job for life? I'm going to bring it every day. You can count on me. You have my loyalty. And so because those bonds between worker and employee are very tenuous here in the United States, that there's a lack of loyalty to the organization that is totally understandable. 3, Because they are lifetime employees, workers are trained in all phases of the company's operation, so they can be plugged into different operations. If so-and-so is out with the COVID-19, other people know how to do that person's tasks. It's sort of like when you go to Disney World and that person operating that particular roller coaster isn't there all day doing that, because that would be dangerous. So they keep shifting people around, moving people around, and they're trained to do many different operations so that they become more interchangeable. 4, while Japanese executives take ultimate responsibility for a company's performance, they involve workers in what are called quality circles to discuss decisions that affect the workers. 5, Japanese companies play a large role in workers' lives. They provide mortgages, schedule social events, and recreational activities. So in many cases, Japanese workers don't go to a bank for a mortgage, they go to their employer. Now, the recession in Japan, which started in 1990 and continues even to this day, more on that when we get to the elderly, gerontology and aging. The recession in Japan starting in 1990 has caused many Japanese companies to no longer offer lifetime jobs for some of the other benefits I just described, but boy, it was painful for them to stop doing so. So, put another way, what are the differences between US and Japanese work models? Number 1, US corporate leaders make quick decisions but struggle with implementation. Japanese leaders, who involve many others early on, are slow to make decisions, but implementation is subsequently rapid. Akio Morita, who is the founder of Sony Corporation, claims that Japanese corporations look ahead 10 years in their business ventures, while corporations in the US look ahead about 10 minutes. That's right, we're about the quick buck. Let the future take care of itself. Okay, so what does this mean? In highly authoritarian decision-making models, somebody at the top or the people at the top make a decision. They then tell the people at the bottom, okay, here's what we want you to do. Now, the people at the bottom or even the people in the middle hear these decisions and they go, oh, that's stupid. That's not going to work. Why did they tell us? We're the ones doing it. We could have told them this isn't going to work. So one of two things happens. Either the people they will implement the decision, but they'll do it in a half-assed manner so that it's not carried out in the way the leadership intended it to be, or they won't even carry it out at all. Now, here's an important point to make. While the people at the top make the decisions, the people carrying out those decisions have enormous power because they either carry it out in the way it was intended or they don't. And so they, in effect, have the power of effectively making the decision by either implementing the boss's decision or not. Now, Japanesely, but that decision was made quickly. Boom, here's what we want you to do. Start doing it. The question is, will they, the workers, do it? In Japanese decision-making models, everybody down to the custodial staff, if it affects them, is involved in the decision. So it takes a while to reach consensus. But once consensus is reached, the decision is immediately implemented. Now, let me comment for a moment on consensus decision-making, which is erroneously thought of as taking 1,000,000 years to decide. First of all, in consensus decision-making models, and boy, have I learned this when I've run committee meetings, is you just tell everybody, look, we got 1 hour to make a decision, and at the end of 1 hour, a decision must be made. I go into lots of committee meetings, and people just shoot the crap for the first 20 minutes, and finally trying to get around to it. And finally, it's like, and I'm a crass pragmatist. Let's get this meeting over with. I got better things to do with my life. And so now there's 10 minutes left. I'm pushed. Come on, we got to make a decision. And boom, 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 a decision's made. Well, we could have done that in the first 15 minutes if we had just focused on doing so. Okay, so with consensus decision making, first of all, you get the value of everybody's input in the room or in the organization. That's important because you get different perspective from the different employees doing their different functions. So many times I've gone to meetings, and perhaps you have too, and some people didn't say much. And then you go outside and in the parking lot go, well, if they would have asked me, I would have said this. I go, yeah, that was a great idea. Why don't you speak up? Well, I don't feel comfortable speaking up in meetings. Okay, I get it. Well, in consensus decision making, we're going to go around the room and every one of you has to have some sort of input. We want to know what you think. So consensus also doesn't mean that we're going to come up with the absolute quote, quote, right decision. Notice this in meetings. Most of the discussion is what will happen if we do this? Well, I don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. No one knows what's going to happen until we try it or not. You know, I think about all the things people said, oh my God, what if we legalize marijuana? This will happen, that will happen. Well, until we legalize marijuana, we won't know for sure what will happen. Now we can study what's happened in the states that have already legalized, and we have some basis for discussion about that. And so consensus decision-making simply says we all agree to try this, knowing we don't know what's going to happen. So that's a different kind of a decision. That's easier to come to. So we'll try this, and if it doesn't work, we'll just try something else. So consensus decision-making is simply, and all decisions should be simply about, we'll try this. We don't know what's going to happen if we implement it. I'll give you another example is the debates I used to see over the years of what will happen if we ever legalize gay marriage. I mean, people would even argue things like it will lead to, oh my God, people will be marrying horses and so forth. No, see, I think there's actually laws against that, or people will be marrying minors. Now, see, there are already laws against that. So all these horrific things that people said would happen if we legalize gay marriage have not even come to pass. None of them have come to pass. Those were absurd arguments. But the point is, we don't know for a fact what's going to happen until we actually legalize gay marriage. Okay, moving on. Another difference between US and Japanese work models. US companies in principle emphasize the job more than the worker, while Japanese companies emphasize the worker more than the job. Well, this is clear in terms of how much Japanese organizations value their workers, as per the comments I previously made about Japanese organizations. And as I pointed out here, in many US organizations, your job is only as good as the company's going. So if people make terrible decisions at the top, too bad we got to lay off 400 workers, but it's not my fault. Yeah, I know we made some bad decisions, but you're all going to have to go. We're going to have to lean out here. So there's no loyalty whatsoever in most organizations to the worker in the United States. 3, in the United States, most executives have a secretary. In Japan, only a few do. In large part, this reflects the more personal style of doing business in Japan, so that the secretary as an intermediary is not necessary. Although it would be nice, boy, I'd love to be able to be in a position where I could say, I'll have my people contact you, your people, we'll do lunch. I don't have people. I'm not Moses, my people. I'd like to, but I don't. 4, Japanese workers' greater involvement in a more personalized organizational environment means less of the worker alienization associated with the more rigid US bureaucratic forms. And 5, the compensation ratio of management to workers in Japan is roughly half that in the United States. Now, let me read that again. The compensation ratio of management, take the top level management compared to the workers. What's the difference in their pay? It's half the difference that it is in the United States. Here's another example. Japan trains 10 engineers for each lawyer. The US trains 10 lawyers for each engineer. Yes, we can't get enough lawyers. Did you know or care that 95% of all lawsuits filed in the world are filed in the US? That's because our new national motto is not e pluribus unum, it's sue the bastard. The third challenge, the changing nature of work. The information jobs of the post-industrial society are different than those of the late industrial society with scientific management principles. Post-industrial organizations feature the following. Number 1, creative freedom. There's less day-to-day supervision of employees because it enhances creativity and imagination of the employees. 2, so don't micromanage. 3, competitive work teams used by Japanese organizations draws out the creative contributions of everyone to tasks while reducing worker alienation. 3, a flatter organization is developing. Check out figure 8-4 on page 210. By spreading responsibility throughout the workplace rather than having it concentrated at the top, organizations change from a pyramid shape to that of an open, flexible organization. Again, figure 8-4, page 210 shows this. Finally, there's greater flexibility. Flexible organizations can respond quickly to changes in the external environment and to the rapidly changing global marketplace, so have to be resilient. So humanizing bureaucracy means fostering an organizational atmosphere that recognizes and encourages the contributions of everyone. Excuse me. Research indicates that this approach produces happier employees and healthier profits. Roger Gassaway, plant manager in General Electric Salisbury plant, said, quote, "It's not all wonderful stuff, but we found that when you treat people like adults, 95% act like adults." Wow. We'll come back to this when we talk about deviants and people in jails. Okay, so the whole point is the trend now in the United States is toward humanizing bureaucracies and reducing the level of authoritarianism in the workplace. Also indicated in your text, or described in your text, I should say, is the McDonaldization of society to symbolize our way of life. Yes, McDonald's, Mickey D's. There are 4 principles of McDonaldization. One is efficiency. Boy, they are efficient at McDonald's. They can crank that crap out quickly. 2, predictability. You know exactly how much that rat burger is going to weigh. Now, it's also important that there's predictability in terms of you know what it's going to taste like too. So that if you're in, I don't know, Podunk, Idaho, and you're deciding, should we eat at this diner we've never been at before, or should we go to McDonald's where we know the food is predictably mediocre, except the fries, they're killer. And so you go, well, yes, well, we can predict the food at McDonald's. We can't predict the food at the diner. 3, there's uniformity. Those burgers weigh exactly the same. Uniformity applies to everything they do there. So yes, while you go around to different parts of the world and they have their own different unique contributions to the menu at McDonald's, basically it's all the same so that it's uniform. I'll give you another example. One of the things that McDonald's and chain outfits would like you to believe is that the only way they can possibly make money is volume. But a study was done of the whole McDonald's operation, and most of the potatoes used in McDonald's are grown in Idaho, and they got the plant right next to them that as soon as they come out of the ground, they're cut up and flash frozen, cut up, fried, and flash frozen, and sent around to all the McDonald's in the region. So, how much do you think it costs McDonald's to produce a bag of fries? It's 5 cents, let alone when you supersize it. Now think about what they charge. That's all profit. They're not getting by in pennies. They're making a lot of money. I'll give you another example. He found in his study that let's say McDonald's went nuts and decided to give every employee $1 an hour raise. They would have to raise their prices by, OMG, 1/2 cent for each product. So they're making tons of money. A 4th aspect about McDonaldization is control through automation. So the idea is as much as you can, you automate the process. And that way it also controls the workers as to exactly what they do. It's kind of like when I was describing me operate the punch, the drill press. You do your function. Everybody does their function. If everybody's doing their function exactly right, the whole McDonald's operation rolls. Now, Part of the automation is some years ago they began to experiment. I think they actually do this in some of the McDonald's now, but they had a robot flipping the burgers, and it was problematic because it's replacing teenagers who need the money, but they also couldn't figure out how to put enough zits on the robot to make it look like a teenager. Then later on, they actually saw one of the robots putting meat in the burger, and that was it. They shut down the whole process. You know that old thing about McDonald's where they've now, I don't know, sold 2 billion burgers and they're only on their 12th cow? I joke, I hope. But actually, it's not true. There are so many cows slaughtered each year for McDonald's that a lot of cows are now volunteering for the process as long as they can be guaranteed they'll be part of a Happy Meal. Here's another insidious thing about McDonald's. Why are their fries better than everybody else's? You know why? Because they use beef tallow. That's right. Now, here's the rub. Some years ago, McDonald's and all the other burger chains were asked to stop using beef products in their fat. Why? Because it's tough when you're a vegetarian or a vegan to eat those fries. You can't eat them. And so McDonald's says, oh, yeah, right, we're going to do that too. Those lying bastards, they didn't, and continued to sell theirs with the beef tallow in it. And I think they still do to this day. I'm not sure about that. Fact check moment. But why? Because that's what makes their fries taste so much better. And that's probably the only reason to go to McDonald's. That and the fact that Coca-Cola there is better than anybody else's Coca-Cola because they do their own manufacturing of the syrup to carbonated water ratio. Let's see. The McDonald's brothers opened up the first McDonald's back in the 1950s, and I believe it was Santa Barbara, California, and they had a couple other locations. And so Joan and Ray Kroc bought out the McDonald's brothers chain for $1.6 million, which was a significant chunk of change back then. But when Joan Kroc died, her husband preceded her, the McDonald's fortune was worth $2.5 billion. Bad deal for the McDonald's brothers. To give you an idea of how extensive Mickey D's is, it operates in 119 countries. KFC operates in 80 countries, by the way. The U.S. averages one fast food restaurant per 10,000 people. Fast food, that's as much as there are doctors in some countries, the ratio. Fast food represents 40% of all restaurant jobs. 70% of employees are age 20 or younger. 15% of U.S. workers had their first job at Mickey D's, and 1 of 8 U.S. adults has worked there. The McDonaldization of society also extends to funerals. You have like McFunerals. So Service Corporation International currently operates 662 funeral homes in 39 states and is aggressively buying operations overseas. They now handle about 15% of all U.S. funerals. So because of the mass scale, they can keep the prices down because coffins, for example, are expensive. So now you even have the option of getting a styrofoam coffin to bury your buns. He waits for the laughter that never comes. The eternal quest. Well, I got a final quote for you. Writing in 1904, Max Weber, who thought bureaucracy was going to be so awesome. He's writing about the modern organizational type. He said, these are specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. Hey, everybody, thus endeth chapter 8. See you soon with chapter 9. Bye for now.